The cold seeped through my undershirt before I fully understood what I was looking at. My own bedroom door, closed. A gym bag I'd never seen before leaning against the hallway baseboard. Men's voices on the other side of the wood, low and laughing. The smell of fast food and something stale drifting under the doorframe. I stood in the hallway of my own house at 11:15 on a Tuesday night, still wearing my coat from the grocery run, a plastic bag hanging from each hand, looking at my bedroom door like it belonged to someone else. My son appeared from the kitchen end of the hall, phone in hand, not quite meeting my eyes. "Dad, hey. So, Marcus and Tyler needed a place. Just for a few days. I put them in your room. You can take the couch. It's just temporary." I set the grocery bags down on the hallway floor. Set them down carefully, like I was handling something fragile. "You put strangers in my bedroom. They're my friends, not strangers. You put your friends in my bedroom, in my house." Without asking me, he finally looked up. His expression carried that particular version of irritation that meant he'd already decided I was being unreasonable. "Dad, you have a couch. It's one night, maybe two. Don't make it a whole thing." I picked up my grocery bags, walked to the kitchen, put the milk in the refrigerator and the bread on the counter, stood at the sink looking out the window at the backyard, at the oak tree I'd planted the year my wife and I moved in, the one that was now taller than the roofline. 31 years I'd lived in this house, raised my son Derek in this house, buried my wife Ellen from this house 7 years ago. I slept on my own couch that night. The leather was cold. My lower back reminded me of every one of my 63 years by 3 in the morning. Marcus and Tyler left after 4 days, not 2. I went back to my bedroom, opened the window, changed the sheets, found an empty beer bottle behind the nightstand. A phone charger still plugged into my outlet, a ring on my wooden dresser top where something wet had sat too long. I wiped the ring with a cloth, looked at myself in the dresser mirror for a long moment. Then I walked to the kitchen table, sat down, and started to think. My son and his wife Sandra had moved in 14 months earlier. Sandra's idea, mostly, or at least she'd done the asking. Derek had stood behind her in my doorway looking like he wasn't sure which way the conversation would go. They'd lost the apartment lease. "Financial stuff," Derek said, waving his hand in that way he had that meant he didn't want to discuss it further. "Just a few months, Dad. Get back on our feet." I'd said yes because he was my son, and Ellen would have said yes, and because the house had felt enormous and echoey since she passed. That was the first mistake. The few months stretched like taffy. 4 months became 8. 8 became 14. Sandra rearranged the pantry in October, moved my coffee to a shelf I needed a step stool to reach. She said she was organizing. In December, she started parking her car in the garage, which meant I parked in the driveway through the coldest months. She said the garage was more organized that way, better use of space. Derek stopped asking permission for things around November. He started informing me. He'd say, "I'm having some guys over Saturday," or "Sandra needs the dining room for her crafts through the weekend." Not questions, announcements. I was 63 years old, a retired civil engineer, owner of a 3-bedroom house in Roanoke, Virginia, that I'd paid off in 2016. I made my own coffee every morning at 6:15. I took walks in the afternoon. I read in the evenings. I had a life that was mine. Or I had. The bedroom incident was the last announcement. The morning after Marcus and Tyler finally left, I drove to the library on Brandon Avenue. I told Derek I was going to the hardware store. I sat at a public computer for 2.5 hours, and I researched Virginia landlord-tenant law with the focus of a man who used to read engineering specs for infrastructure projects. I learned about tenants at will. I learned about the required written notice period. I learned what constituted occupancy versus ownership. I filled 4 pages of a small notebook, with careful handwriting, the kind I used when I was reviewing bridge load calculations 30 years ago. I drove home, put the notebook in the metal lockbox in my coat closet behind the winter jackets, made a sandwich, and ate it at the kitchen table while Sandra told me about a conflict at her yoga class, without once asking how my morning went. I added the date and time to the notebook that evening. Page 2. Began a log. Over the following 10 days, I watched my own house like I was assessing a project site. Sandra moved the living room furniture on the third day. Not slightly shifted. Rearranged entirely. My reading chair, which had sat beside the east window for 7 years, was pushed into the corner facing the wall. She put a decorative bench there instead. Something she'd ordered online. Better flow, she told me when I came downstairs and stood looking at it. I moved my reading chair back after she went to bed. She moved it back the next morning. I documented both dates and times. Derek borrowed my truck on the 6th day without mentioning it until he was already backing out. I stood in the garage doorway watching my own truck pull into the street. He brought it back 3 hours later with the gas tank reading a quarter less than it had been. I filled it at the station on Williamson Road and saved the receipt. On the 9th day, Sandra was in the backyard on the phone, pacing the way she did when she was talking to her mother in Cincinnati. Her voice carried through the kitchen window I'd left cracked. "He's fine," she said. "He just gets confused about what's his sometimes. You know how older people get attached to routines. We try to be patient." I stood very still at the kitchen counter. "I'm not sure he always understands the practical realities anymore," Sandra continued. "Derek worries, but what can you do?" I wrote it down. Date, time, quoted her from memory as precisely as I could. On the 12th day, I called an attorney. Jeffrey Harmon had an office on Campbell Avenue in a building that used to be a savings and loan. He was in his late 40s, methodical, with the kind of unhurried voice that suggested he'd heard every version of this situation before. He had me walk through the timeline from the beginning, ask questions at specific points, took his own notes. "They've never paid rent," I confirmed. "Any utility contributions?" "Nothing." "Any written agreement of any kind?" "No." He leaned back. "Virginia requires 30 days written notice to vacate for month-to-month tenants at will. Since there's no lease, the property owner's rights are very clear. After 30 days, if they don't leave, you file an unlawful detainer action. Court date within a few weeks. Given your ownership documentation and their complete lack of financial contribution, you'll win. How long from notice to physically out? 60 to 90 days, typically. What do I need to do first?" He walked me through it. Written notice, dated, signed, delivered in person or by posted mail. Specific language about vacating the premises. He also mentioned something else. Given what you've described about the competency comments, you might want a documented medical evaluation. Not because you need it. Because if they try to claim you're confused or impaired, you want that refuted cleanly. I hadn't told him about my plans yet, and he was already thinking 3 steps ahead. I liked that. "I also want to talk about asset protection," I said. He nodded like he'd expected this too. We talked for another 40 minutes about a revocable living trust, what it could accomplish, what it would cost. He gave me a figure for both services together. I wrote him a check from the account that had only my name on it, the one Ellen and I had kept separate from the household account even when we were together. Old habit, useful now. He said he'd prepare the notice within 48 hours. I drove to the grocery store, bought milk the way I always covered my tracks. Came home and told Derek the doctor had said my blood pressure was stable. He said good, and looked back at his phone. I started carrying a small digital recorder in my shirt pocket. The kind used by journalists, nothing conspicuous. Virginia is a one-party consent state. I verified this at the library before buying it. The next 2 weeks moved strangely, slow at the surface and fast underneath. Sandra escalated the competency performance carefully, like someone following a script they'd worked on. She mentioned my forgetfulness to Derek's friend who came for dinner on a Thursday. "He seems like he's been a little scattered lately. We worry." She said this within earshot of me, as if I were slightly out of range of normal hearing. The recorder in my pocket caught every syllable. My blood pressure medication appeared on the kitchen counter the following Monday. I kept it in my bedroom. I photographed it, checked the timestamp on my phone camera, carried it back to my room. It appeared on the bathroom counter 2 days later, then on the dining table. Each time I photographed first, retrieved second, recorded the date and location in my notebook. I emailed the photos to Jeffrey Harmon along with my log notes. He wrote back the same afternoon, "Continue documenting. This is exactly what we need." On a Friday afternoon, Sandra brought our neighbor Mrs. Patterson into the kitchen while I was reading at the table. She didn't knock on the back door, just walked her in. "Mrs. Patterson, this is Raymond's father. Raymond, Mrs." Patterson mentioned her back has been giving her trouble. "I thought you two could chat." I looked up from my book. "I'm Derek's father. Raymond is the mail carrier on this street." Sandra laughed brightly. "Of course. I meant Derek. He's just always on my mind." I misspoke. I smiled pleasantly at Mrs. Patterson, offered her coffee. She declined, said she had to get back, something in her eyes suggesting the conversation had not gone the way she'd been led to expect. I wrote it down. I also checked our phone plan that evening. Family plan meant I could access the account portal, call logs, text timestamps. Not content, but I forwarded the account activity report to my own email and then to Harmon. On a Wednesday, 3 weeks after my first attorney meeting, the notice was ready. Harmon emailed the PDF. I drove to the library and printed a copy. Read it twice, sitting at the public computer. Formal language, clear deadline, specific property address. I replied from the library. Proceed. 2 days later, I was sitting in the backyard with my afternoon coffee when I heard the front doorbell from outside. Derek's voice from inside. "Yeah?" A pause. Muted conversation at the front door. Then Sandra's voice, sharp and immediate, cutting through the walls. "What is this? What does this mean?" I stayed in my yard chair, watched a sparrow land on the oak tree's lower branch and tilt its head. The back door opened hard. Derek stood in the doorframe. "Dad, what did you do?" I turned around. The notice had been served. He held the papers out. His hand was not entirely steady. "This is from a lawyer. This says, we have to leave." "Yes, you're evicting us." That's what the notice says. He came down the back steps. Sandra appeared in the doorframe behind him, holding her phone in both hands. "You're joking," Derek said. "This is because of the bedroom thing? Because of Marcus and Tyler?" "Dad, I apologized for that." "No, you said it was just temporary." "That's not the same thing." His jaw moved. "What is this really about?" 14 months of living in my home without paying rent, without contributing to utilities or groceries, without asking permission before making decisions about my property. The bedroom was the last thing, not the only thing. Sandra came down the steps. Her voice had that careful quality she used when she wanted to sound reasonable and was not feeling reasonable. "Raymond, we're family. You don't evict family. You talk to family. I talked to you in October about the pantry. In November, about the truck. In December, about the parking. In January, about the furniture. Nothing changed." "This is insane," Derek said. "Where are we supposed to go? You have 30 days to figure that out." Sandra held up her phone. "I'm calling my father." Derek looked at her quickly, some message passing between them. Then back at me. "Dad, just let's talk about this. Let's sit down and talk." I stood, took my coffee cup with me. "We can talk through attorneys. That's the appropriate channel now." I walked past him into the house. That night, their voices carried through the ceiling. I lay on my bed listening to the rhythm without the words. Stress had a specific acoustic. I recognized it. Sandra's voice went up and down several times. Derek's responses were shorter, lower. The sound of a laptop clicking. More voices, probably a phone call. I put in earplugs and slept. Sandra's father called the next morning. His name was Gerald, retired postal worker, lived in Akron, Ohio. Gerald and I had spoken maybe 6 times in 4 years of Sandra and Derek's marriage. "Raymond," he said without preamble, "Sandra called me last night. I figured she might. I want to hear your side of it. All of it," I told him. From the beginning. 14 months. The pantry, the garage, the truck, the furniture, the bedroom incident, the competency comments to the neighbors, the medication staged around the house. I spoke for 12 minutes without interruption. Gerald was quiet for a moment after I finished. "I didn't know about the medication thing," he said. "Or the neighbors. Sandra told you something different. She told me you were confused and acting out, that you'd offered them a permanent arrangement and then changed your mind. I have never in my life offered anyone a permanent free arrangement with my home. I would remember that. I believe you." He exhaled slowly. "The honest truth, Raymond, is that Sandra has always looked for the easiest path. I love my daughter, but I've never been blind to her. And Derek, he's a good kid, but he follows where she leads. They should have been paying you something from the beginning. That's just right. Thank you for saying that. I want you to know I'm not going to talk you out of this. They're adults. They need to handle this themselves. But I wanted to hear the truth from you directly. I appreciate that, Gerald. You have my number if you ever want to talk, man to man. I do now. Thank you, Gerald. I added the date and substance of the call to my log. Another clean data point. Harmon called that afternoon. They've contacted an attorney, a man named Calvin Drew, storefront practice over in Salem. He filed a response claiming oral agreement for long-term residence. He's also raising questions about your competency. I expected that. I have a physician in mind for your evaluation, Dr. Margaret Folds. She's thorough. Her documentation is very clean in court situations. Can you go this week? I went Thursday morning. Dr. Folds' office was on Brambleton, second floor, bright windows. She was systematic in the way of someone who had performed this evaluation many times and understood exactly what it was for. I scored 30 out of 30 on the cognitive assessment. She noted this in her written documentation with specific test results and added a paragraph that included the phrase fully capable of independent decision-making regarding personal, financial, and property matters. No evidence of cognitive decline, confusion, or impaired judgment. I drove home with the folder on the passenger seat and bought groceries on the way back. Sandra asked if the appointment had gone okay. I said fine, cholesterol a little high. Nothing serious. She nodded and returned to her phone. The following 2 weeks were the coldest the house had been. Not temperature, atmosphere. Derek and Sandra stopped performing pleasantness. They occupied the house with tight, careful movements. Conversations at meals became functional. Pass the salt. Someone left the back door open. The utility bill is higher this month. I continued my routines. Morning coffee, afternoon walk, evening reading. I said good morning, received back whatever I received back, and went about my day. I documented. February 4th. Derek came home at 6 in the evening, saw me in the living room, and changed direction to go upstairs without speaking. February 7th. Sandra told me not to use the kitchen between 5 and 7 because she was meal prepping. This is my kitchen, I said quietly. She looked at me for a moment, then turned and walked away. The recorder caught her muttering something under her breath that included the word difficult. February 9th, I came downstairs at midnight for water. Derek's laptop was open on the kitchen table to a search page. The most recent terms were visible. Grounds to contest eviction, Virginia, and proving verbal tenancy agreement, and how to prove owner incompetency, no diagnosis. I took a photo of the screen in the dark. The timestamp on the photo would show. February 11th, Derek had friends over. They stayed until after midnight, voices and television loud enough that the walls carried it. I called the non-emergency line at 11:45 after the neighbor's lights came on down the street. An officer arrived within 20 minutes. Derek's friends were asked to leave. Derek stood in the doorway watching them go, not looking at me directly. Do that again, and I call. Before midnight, I told him. He went inside without answering. February 14th, the court date was set for the 27th. Harmon emailed me the details. Bring nothing, he said. I have everything we need. Wear the Navy suit if you have one. I did have one. Ellen had picked it out for a retirement dinner 8 years ago. I pressed it carefully the night before. February 27th was overcast and cold in Roanoke. I left at 8:30 for a 10 o'clock hearing. Harmon met me in the courthouse corridor on the second floor, briefcase organized, expression neutral and professional. The judge's name was Harold Simmons. Late 50s, thick-framed glasses, moved with the deliberate economy of a man who ran a tight docket and intended to keep it that way. Derek and Sandra arrived at 9:40 with Calvin Drew, who had the look of an attorney accustomed to arguing uphill battles. Drew's folder was visibly thin. They didn't look at me. I sat with Harmon and read over my notes one final time. The bailiff called the case. Harmon and Drew approached the bench. Drew presented first. Your Honor, my clients have resided at the property for over a year based on a clear verbal agreement with the petitioner. Mr. Raymond Calloway indicated on multiple occasions that they were welcome to stay as long as needed, and that the arrangement could be considered indefinite. Judge Simmons looked up. Do you have this agreement in any form? Email, text, written note of any kind? It was verbal, Your Honor, a family understanding. Witnesses to this verbal agreement who are not parties to this case. The parties themselves understood it clearly. That's not a witness. Continue. Drew shifted. Additionally, we have concerns about Mr. Calloway's cognitive state at the time of these agreements and at the time of the eviction filing. There is behavioral evidence suggesting possible confusion and impaired judgment. What behavioral evidence? Neighbor observations, misplaced items, erratic behavior. Do you have a medical evaluation indicating cognitive impairment? We have circumstantial. Does a licensed physician diagnose Mr. Calloway with any cognitive disorder? Not formally, Your Honor. Judge Simmons looked at him steadily over his glasses. Then you have speculation, not evidence. Present what you have. Drew called Derek to the stand. Derek spoke carefully, clearly rehearsed. My father invited us to stay, he said, as long as we needed. He specifically said he didn't want us worrying about money. He wanted family close after my mother passed. Harmon cross-examined without standing. Did you pay rent at any point? No. It was a family arrangement. Utilities? Groceries? Any financial contribution of any kind in 14 months? We helped around the house. Helped how, specifically? Can you give me 3 specific regular tasks with frequency and dates? Derek paused. General upkeep, cleaning, that sort of thing. Your father's bank records show 0 deposits from you or your wife during the entire period of your residence. Not $1 exchanged hands. You maintain no financial responsibility of any kind for 14 months in someone else's home, and the foundation of your defense is a verbal promise you cannot document. And no one else heard. Derek's jaw tightened. That's not... Thank you. No further questions. Harmon presented our case methodically. Property deed, clear title, mortgage satisfied in 2019. My name only. Bank statements. 14 months. 0 incoming payments from respondents. Doctor. Fultz's evaluation, complete cognitive assessment, 30 of 30. Conclusion paragraph read aloud in full. Then the photographs. Medication appearing in various rooms with timestamps. Then the account activity printout. Then the recorder transcript, partial. The specific conversation in which Sandra described me to Mrs. Patterson. And then he placed the screenshot of Derek's laptop search on the table. These are authenticated by metadata timestamp. The search terms visible were conducted at 12:04 a.m. on February the 9th. The search for how to prove owner incompetency, no diagnosis, is particularly instructive, given that the respondents are simultaneously claiming in this courtroom that their concerns about petitioner's competency were genuine and not strategic. Drew objected on foundation grounds. Harmon had foundation. The judge admitted it. Judge Simmons reviewed the photograph carefully. He was quiet for a long moment. Harmon called Mrs. Patterson briefly. She testified that she had found the encounter Sandra arranged to be staged in a way that seemed designed to create a specific impression. She had not observed any confusion or impairment in me in the years she'd known me as a neighbor. Judge Simmons removed his glasses, placed them on the bench in front of him. He looked at Derek and Sandra directly. This property belongs to the petitioner. There is no written agreement. There is no credible evidence of a verbal agreement beyond the self-serving and uncorroborated testimony of the parties who benefit from claiming one. There is also a documented medical evaluation confirming the petitioner's full cognitive competency, and substantial evidence suggesting that concerns about his mental state were manufactured rather than genuine. He picked up his gavel. Judgment for petitioner. Respondents are to vacate the premises no later than April 10th. Failure to comply will result in sheriff-assisted removal. The gavel came down once. Sandra made a small sound. Derek sat very still. Harmon shook my hand. Done. We walked toward the elevator. Behind us, Sandra's voice. You're going to die alone in that house. You know that? You chose a house over your son. I stopped, turned around. I chose myself, after 14 months of choosing everyone else. Derek put a hand on her arm. Sandra, stop. She shook it off. He destroyed this family. He looked at me then, really looked at me, for the first time in a long while. His expression was not anger. It was something more complicated than that. Something I recognized as the first stage of understanding. I turned and got on the elevator. The doors closed. On the drive home, I stopped at the hardware store. Not as a cover story this time. I bought a new doorbell camera and a better lock for my bedroom door. Projects for the afternoon. I also called an estate planner Harmon had recommended. Patricia Webb. I had an appointment the following week. I had known for some time where the house should go. Ellen and I had talked about it once, years ago, one of those late evening conversations on the back porch that cover everything. We'd been married 26 years at the time. She'd said, if it came to it, the house should go somewhere. It does good. She'd been thinking about the veterans shelter she volunteered at before she got sick. I'd kept that in mind. Patricia Webb's office was in a converted Victorian near downtown. She was efficient, clear, and asked good questions. I told her about the Veterans Resource Center on Colonial Avenue. I'd stayed there myself for 6 weeks in 1984, between tours, between jobs, before I had a foothold in anything. They'd given me a bed, 2 meals a day, and a job board. Ellen had found me through a mutual friend that same year. The house going there felt like the most honest thing I could do. Patricia walked me through the trust documents. Revocable, which meant I maintained complete control. I could change my mind. I retained ownership in every practical sense. But the structure was established, the beneficiary designated. I signed each page carefully. She notarized with her official seal. I drove home with a folder on the passenger seat. 3 days later, Derek was in the kitchen when I came down for coffee. He'd clearly been awake for a while. He looked at me the way he hadn't since he was young, like he was genuinely uncertain how I'd respond. "Dad, can we talk?" I poured coffee, sat at the kitchen table. He sat across from me. His hands were flat on the table. I know what I did was wrong. All of it. Not just one thing, not just the court case. All of it. Using your house like it was ours. Sandra pushing on things. Me letting her push. Me not seeing what that cost you. He was quiet for a moment. I don't know when I stopped treating you like my father and started treating you like a problem to manage. I don't know when that happened, but I know it happened and I know it wasn't right. I looked at him, my son, 36 years old. Ellen's nose, my stubborn jaw. "I appreciate that," I said. Is there any version of this where—" He stopped, started again. "Is there anything I can do?" I thought about that honestly. The way I used to think through load calculations, all the variables accounted for, nothing assumed. You can do the work of becoming someone Sandra can't lead down the wrong road. You can figure out what kind of man you actually want to be. You can raise your kids, when you have them, to understand that other people's things are not their things. He nodded slowly. The house? That decision's made. He looked down at the table. I figured, the trust is for a Veterans Resource Center. The one on Colonial Avenue. Your mother volunteered there. I stayed there once. A long time ago. Something shifted in his face. His eyes went a little bright before he controlled it. I didn't know that. About you staying there. Before your mother. Before any of this. They helped me get my feet under me. He was quiet. Then he said, "I'm sorry, Dad. I'm genuinely sorry." I believed him. That was a different thing from being able to undo it. The weeks that followed settled into something unfamiliar and welcome. Derek and Sandra packed without warfare. The cold standoff of the post-eviction week softened into something more like exhaustion. They moved methodically, asking about individual items, accepting my answers. There were no scenes about furniture, no staged disappearances. Sandra came to me once, alone, on a Sunday afternoon. She stood in the kitchen doorway with her hands at her sides. "I'm not a bad person," she said. "I don't think you are. I think you made bad choices for a long time and no one stopped you. That's a hard thing to learn this way." She looked at me for a moment. "I am sorry. For the stuff with the neighbors. The medication. That went too far. I know. She left without anything more between us. But she'd come. That was more than I'd expected." April 10th arrived gray and mild. The rental truck came at 8 in the morning. 2 of Derek's friends helped. different ones from before. The work was quiet and organized. By 10:30, the last boxes were loaded. Sandra brought the 2 cat carriers from upstairs. I hadn't known they'd gotten cats. Derek did a final walk through the house, came back to the entryway where I was standing. He held out his keys, removed the house key from the ring carefully, and placed it in my palm. "I'm going to be better," he said. "I can't prove that right now. But I'm going to be. I know you are." He looked at me once more and then walked out to where Sandra was waiting by the truck. The truck pulled out of the driveway. I watched from the porch until it turned the corner. I went back inside. The house held the specific silence of a space recently vacated. Not empty. Reset. I stood in the middle of the living room. My reading chair was already back at the east window where it belonged. I'd moved it there the week before. I sat in it. The morning light came in the way it always had, across the floor in a long rectangle, lighting the dust motes I'd have to vacuum later. I sat there for an hour without moving, not thinking about anything in particular, just existing in my own house, in my own chair, in the quiet I'd been missing for 14 months. The phone calls started that afternoon, 4 that day, 6 the next. Derek's number appearing on the screen, going to voicemail without my answering. Sandra called twice. I let those go too. By the end of the first week, 41 calls between them. I read his text without responding. "Dad, please call me back. I want to make sure you're okay. I know you're angry, but I want to stay in your life. Please." I wasn't angry. That was the thing. I was at peace. Those are very different states, and one does not require the other to resolve. I blocked both numbers on the 19th day. The phone went quiet. Gerald called from Akron 2 weeks later. He'd heard from Sandra that I'd blocked Derek's calls. "Can I ask you something directly?" he said. "You can always ask. Is this permanent? Are you cutting Derek out of your life?" I was quiet for a moment. "I'm giving myself time," I said. "That's different from cutting him out. If he does the work he said he would, if he becomes who I think he can become, there will be a time for conversation. But not from a place of emergency. Not because he's scared or in need, from a place where we can actually see each other clearly." Gerald was quiet. "I think that's fair," he said finally. "I think that's the fairest thing I've heard in this whole situation." We talked for a while longer. His wife had been asking about me, he said. Sandra's mother, who I had met only twice. Apparently she'd had some feelings about the eviction that didn't entirely align with Sandra's framing of events. Gerald had set her straight. We made plans for coffee the next time he came down to visit. He came to Roanoke twice a year, he said. He'd let me know. After we hung up, I sat on the back porch for a while. The oak tree was fully in leaf now, the early May light filtering through it green and gold. Ellen had loved this time of year specifically. The way the new leaves were still light enough to be translucent in the afternoon sun, I talked to her sometimes, on the back porch. Not out loud, not in any way I'd admit to at a dinner party, but internally, the way you carry a person's voice with you after they're gone. "I think you'd have let this go on longer than I did," I told her. "You were always more patient." I could almost hear her laugh at that. The specific laugh she had when I said something that was accurate but framed generously. "Maybe," she would have said, "but not forever." June passed quietly. I repainted the second bedroom, the one that had been Derek and Sandra's, pale blue. Ellen and I had always meant to do that room blue. I planted tomatoes in the back garden, something I hadn't been able to do last year because Sandra had decided the back beds should be ornamental. I had 3 retired colleagues over for a cookout in late June, men I'd worked with at the engineering firm for years. They sat on the back porch and argued about baseball and complained about city planning projects the way we always had. "You seem like yourself again," one of them said. Bill, who'd retired 2 years before me. "I feel like myself again," I told him. "It's not the same as seeming like it." He nodded. He understood the difference. Mrs. Patterson waved from her yard one evening and then came over to apologize properly for the kitchen visit Sandra had orchestrated. I told her there was nothing to apologize for. She hadn't known what she'd been walked into. She brought me tomatoes from her own garden the following week. We stood at the back fence and talked about the neighborhood for 20 minutes in the evening cool. In July, Derek called from a number I didn't recognize. I answered, not knowing who it was. Dad, don't hang up. Please. I didn't hang up. He talked for a few minutes. He and Sandra were in couples counseling. He'd started attending a men's group at a church downtown. Not for religion specifically, but for accountability, he said. He'd gotten a second job to build savings. I listened without interrupting. I'm not asking to come back, he said. I'm not asking for anything. I just wanted you to know I heard what you said, that I'm doing it, that it's real. I appreciate you telling me that. Can I call again sometime? Not often, just sometimes. Yes. That was all. We ended the call without a lot of words. I sat with the phone in my hand for a while after. Not sad, not relieved. Something more neutral than either. The beginning of a very long process that might or might not arrive somewhere good. That was enough for now. A Saturday afternoon in late July, I drove out to Carvin's Cove. Ellen and I used to hike out there when she was well enough. I hadn't been since the year before she died. The trail was the same. The reservoir still caught the light the same way in the afternoon. I walked for 2 hours without music, without a podcast, without anything in my ears. I thought about the house on the way back. My house. Bought it when I was 32 years old with a down payment that had taken 4 years to save. In the years after I'd gotten stable, after the veterans shelter and the job board and the girl who would become my wife, found me in a better version of myself than I'd been before. The house had always represented the distance traveled, not wealth. Distance. I'd almost let someone else dismantle that. Almost. I stopped at the hardware store on the way home, bought new drawer pulls for the kitchen. Small thing. The old ones had been there since we moved in. I replaced them that evening, one by one, at the kitchen table with a screwdriver and a beer. The new ones were brushed nickel, simple. Ellen would have had an opinion about whether nickel or bronze was better in that kitchen. I could hear her voice in my head making the argument. I went with nickel. She'd have let me be right about something, occasionally. The house was quiet. My kind of quiet now. Morning coffee, afternoon walks, evening reading, the occasional barbecue. Gerald called every few weeks. Mrs. Patterson brought tomatoes. The 3 colleagues came for another cookout in August. One evening in late August, I was in the front yard edging the lawn. The new neighbors across the street had left their sprinkler running past dusk, and the smell of wet grass and cooling concrete was everywhere. A car slowed in front of my house. I recognized the car. The older sedan Derek had bought after selling his truck, small sacrifice in a larger accounting of choices. The car stopped across the street. Engine went off. I kept working, moved the edger along the sidewalk seam, steady, methodical. 5 minutes. I glanced without appearing to glance. Derek sat in the driver's seat, window down, looking at the house. His expression from that distance was unreadable, but his stillness told me something. He was looking at what he'd had and what he'd done with it. People do that. They come back to the place and look at it. It's a thing humans do when they're finally processing. 10 minutes. He hadn't moved. I finished the edging on the south side, moved to the north. My back was to him. I knew he was still there by the absence of his engine restarting. 15 minutes. I heard the engine turn over, saw the car in my peripheral vision pull slowly from the curb. He drove down the street in the direction of wherever he lived now. I watched him go for a moment. Then I set down the edger, sat on the porch steps, and looked at the street. The neighbor kids were drawing chalk animals on their driveway, 2 houses down. Someone's radio from an open window played something old and pleasant. He had come. He had looked. He had not been able to cross the street. That was information, not cruelty. He needed to feel the weight of the distance before he could even begin to understand how to close it. I couldn't hand that to him. Nobody could hand that to him. I went inside and made dinner. Nothing special. Chicken and rice, the way I always made it, the way I'd made it since before anyone else was eating at my table. I ate at the kitchen table with the window open. The evening light was long and gold, birds getting in their final songs before dark. I washed my dish, dried it, put it back in the cabinet, turned off the kitchen light, walked through my house, room by room, the way I sometimes did in the evenings now. Not from anxiety, just from the satisfaction of knowing each room was what it was supposed to be. Living room, my chair at the east window. Second bedroom, pale blue walls now. Third bedroom, set up for guests, though I hadn't had any yet. My bedroom, the dresser with the old ring, finely sanded and refinished. The window that caught the morning light. I sat on the edge of my bed. Through the window, the streetlights were beginning to come on one by one. Ellen had been right about the house. In the end, the way she was right about most things. It wasn't the structure that mattered. It was what you built inside it. The life, the choices, the willingness to defend what was yours when the moment required it. I'd been slow to recognize the moment, but I'd recognized it. That was enough. I got ready for bed at 9:30. Read for an hour. Set my book on the nightstand. The house settled into its nighttime sounds. The refrigerator's low hum, the oak tree in the backyard moving in the breeze, the distant sound of traffic on the main road. I turned off the light. For the first time in a very long time, the darkness felt like it belonged to me. If this story stayed with you, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Stormborn Vengeance. Leave a comment telling me what time it is where you are right now. And if you want to hear the next story, it's waiting for you in the box on the left. Thank you for being here.